Hello everyone, this is Reverend Dr. Roger Paul. I'm here with my wife, Reverend Diane Paul. And tonight we're going to read the second half of paper 94. And we're in section 6. And this starts on page 1033. Let's just get started. Okay. Lazi and Confucius. About 600 years before the arrival of Michael, it seemed to Melchizedek, long since departed from the flesh, that the purity of his teaching on earth was being unduly jeopardized by general absorption into the older Urantia beliefs. It appeared for a time that his mission as a forerunner of Michael might be in danger of failing. And in the 6th century before Christ, through an unusual coordination of spiritual agencies, not all of which are understood even by the planetary supervisors, Urantia witnessed a most unusual presentation of manifold religious truth. Through the agency of several human teachers, the Salem Gospel was restated and revitalized, and it was then presented much as persisted to the times of this writing. So this is kind of interesting because even the planetary supervisor don't know why this spiritual revival took place. That's kind of unusual. All right, let's go to the next page.
This unique century of spiritual progress was characterized by great religious, moral, and philosophic teachers all over the civilized world. In China, the two outstanding teachers were Laozi and Confucius. Hey, Rodney.
Laozi built directly upon the concept of the Salem traditions when he declared that Tao to be the first cause of all creation. Lao was a man of great spiritual vision. He taught that man's eternal destiny was everlasting union with Tao, supreme God and the universal King. His comprehension of ultimate causation was most discerning, for he wrote, "Unity arises out of the absolute Tao, and from unity there appeared cosmic duality. And from such duality, Trinity springs forth into existence. And Trinity is the primal source of all reality. All reality is ever in balance between the potentials and actuals of the cosmos, and these are eternally harmonized by the spirit of divinity." Okay, so he built directly on the concept of one universal God or one universal Father. Ask Rodney let Rodney read the next.
Okay.
Rodney, would you read the next one, please?
Yes. Pronounce it right again.
Lao-tzu. Yeah, it's really Lao-tzu.
Laozi
Lao-tzu, yeah.
also made one of the earliest presentations of the doctrine of returning good for evil. Quote, "Goodness begets goodness, but to the one who is truly good, evil also begets goodness."
So Jesus' doctrine of loving your enemies, this is an expression from this concept of goodness begets goodness, but also one who is truly good, evil begets goodness also. So that's why you should love your enemies and your friends and return good for evil. Which is a great concept. We wouldn't have wars if everybody did that. So would you take the next one?
He taught the return of the creature to the Creator and pictured life as the emergence of a personality from the cosmic potentials, while death was like the returning home of this creature personality. His concept of true faith was unusual, and he too likened it to the attitude of a little child.
It's learning like a little child, right? His understanding of the internal purpose of God was clear. Excuse me, are we getting feedback?
I think Rodney has a little feedback.
Feedback?
Yeah.
Yeah. understanding the eternal purpose of God was clear. For he said, the absolute deity does not strive, but is always victorious. He does not coerce mankind, but always stands ready to respond to their true desires. The will of God is eternal in patience and eternal in the inevitability of its expression. And of the true religionists, he said, in expressing the truth that it is more blessed to give than to receive, the good man seeks not to retain truth for himself, but rather attempts to bestow these riches upon his fellows. For that is the realization of truth, that the will of the absolute God always benefits, never destroys. The purpose of the true believer is always to act, but never to coerce. So basically he's saying the same thing your intro book talks about, is the way we learn something is by teaching others. So when we learn something, the way we know we've learned those lessons is by teaching others the lessons we learned. And that is done by to those who want to learn it, and don't coerce them into knowing it. All right. Rodney, would you take the next one, please?
Well, this guy seems right on it.
Really?
Well, again, you pronounce it Lao.
Yeah, Laos.
No.
Laos. Laos is teaching of non-restrictance,
Resistance.
and a distinction which he made between action and coercion can later perverted into the beliefs of quote, saying, doing, and thinking nothing. But Lao never taught such error, albeit his presentation of non-resistance has been a factor in the further development of the Pacific predilections of the Chinese people.
So the Chinese people became pacifist after this teaching of Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu. And that's what they're talking about here. But he did not teach the idea of seeing and doing and thinking nothing. That's an error. Okay, and that's what he's accredited to teaching, but he did not. All right. Here.
But the popular Taoism of 20th century Urantia has very little in common with the lofty sentiments and the cosmic concepts of the old philosopher who taught the truth as he perceived it, which was that faith in the absolute God is the source of that divine energy which will remake the world, and by which man ascends to spiritual union with Tao,
Tao. Yeah.
the eternal deity and creator absolute of the universes.
So his concept of Tao was the one absolute God. Okay, so that's the revival of the concept of one God, what Melchizedek taught. All right. Oh, shoot. Lost it. There we go. Confucius was a younger contemporary of Lao in 6th century China. Confucius based his doctrines upon the better moral traditions of the long history of the Yellow race, and he was also somewhat influenced by the lingering traditions of the Salem missionaries. His chief work consisted in the compilation of the wise sayings of ancient philosophers. So they always say Confucius says, right? He was a rejected teacher during his lifetime, but his writings and teachings have ever since exerted a great influence in China and Japan. Confucius set a new pace for the shamans in that he put morality in the place of magic, but he built too well. He made a new fetish out of order and established a respect for ancestral conduct that is still venerated by the Chinese at this time of this writing. So he was actually a younger contemporary of Lao, and during his teaching times, when he was teaching, he was virtually unknown. He was not respected at all, but later on he was. So that's one of those things, you never know what you do now is not going to make some impact in the future, right? Rodney, would you take the next one?
He Confucian preachment of morality was predicated on the theory that the earthly way was the distorted shadow of the heavenly way, that the true pattern of temporal civilization was the mere reflection of the eternal order of heaven. The potential God concept in Confucianism was almost completely subordinate to the emphasis placed upon the way of heaven, the pattern of the cosmos.
You notice how all these teachings get morphed over time.
The teaching of Laos have been lost to all but a few in the Orient, but the writings of Confucius have ever since constituted the basis of the moral fabric of the culture of almost a third of the Orientians. These Confucian precepts, while perpetuating the best of the past, were somewhat inimical to the very Chinese spirit of investigation that had produced those achievements which were so venerated. The influence of these doctrines was unsuccessfully combated both by the imperial efforts of Qing Shi Huang Tai and by the teachings of Motai, who proclaimed a brotherhood founded not on ethical duty, but on the love of God. He sought to rekindle the ancient quest for new truth, but his teachings failed because of the vigorous opposition of the disciples of Confucius.
Like many other spiritual and moral teachers, both Confucius and Melchizedek was eventually deified by their followers in those spiritually dark ages of China which intervened between the decline and perversion of the Taoist faith and the coming of the Buddhist missionaries from India. During the spiritually decadent century, the religion of the yellow race degenerated into a pitiful theology wherein swarming devil, dragons, and evil spirits all betoken returning fear of the unenlightened mortal mind. And China, once at the head of the human society because of an advanced religion, then fell behind because of the temporary failure to progress in the true path of the development of the God consciousness, which is indispensable to the true progress, not only to the individual mortal, but also of intricate and complex civilizations which characterizes the advance of culture and society on the evolutionary planet of time and space. Interesting. Rodney, would you take the next one, please?
Yes. Number 7, Guatemala
Siddhartha, yeah.
Okay, contemporary word. How do you pronounce that again?
Lao Tzu,
Lao Tzu.
yeah.
And Confucius in China, another great teacher of truth arose in India. Gautama Siddhartha was born in the 6th century before Christ in the North Indian province of Nepal. His followers later made it appear that he was the son of a fabulous, wealthy ruler. But, in truth, he was the heir apparent to the throne of a petty chieftain. He ruled by severance over a small and secluded mountain valley in the southern Himalayas.
Funny how people get built up bigger than they are, isn't it?
I've read this book, though. It's excellent. Gautama formulated those theories which grew into the philosophy of Buddhism after 6 years of the futile practice of yoga. Siddhartha made a determined but unavailing fight against the growing caste system. There was a lofty sincerity and a unique unselfishness about this young prophet prince that greatly appealed to the men of those days. He detracted from the practice of seeking individual salvation through physical affliction and personal pain, and he exhorted his followers to carry his gospel to all the world.
And that was basically the spread of Buddhism. Right? Amid the confusion and the extreme cult practices of India, the saner and more moderate teachings of Gautama came as a refreshing relief. He denounced God's priests and their sacrifices, but he too prevailed to perceive the personality of the one universal. Not believing in the existence of individual human souls, Gautama, of course, made a valiant fight against the time-honored belief in transmigration of the soul. He made a noble effort to deliver men from fear and to make them feel at ease and at home in the great universe, but he failed to show them the pathway to the real and supernal home of ascending mortals, paradise, and to the expanding service of the eternal existence. Okay, so he made a fight against the concept, which was very popular in India, about and it still is today in many places, transmigration of the soul. And what they believed is that when you die, your soul was either transmigrated into an animal or a tree or a bush or just about anything. And he fought against that. All right.
They would stay on this planet.
What was that, Rodney?
They would more or less stay on this planet.
Yeah, he believed they stayed on this planet. And that's why they said he failed to teach people the pathway to paradise, because they didn't have a concept of going on to the mansion worlds and then eventually to paradise.
They felt they had no pathway.
No pathway, yeah. All right.
Rodney. Guatemala was a real prophet, and had he heeded the instruction of the hermit, Godad, which I think is in the Jesus Papers,
Yeah.
he might have aroused all India by the inspiration of the revival of the sound gospel of salvation by faith. Godad was descendant through a family that had never lost the traditions of the Melchizedek missionaries.
And he was just a hermit, moved from place to place and taught his beliefs.
At Benares, Gautama founded his school, and it was during its second year that a pupil, Gautam, imparted to his teacher the traditions of the Salem missionaries about the Melchizedek covenant with Abraham. And while Siddhartha did not have a very clear concept of the universal Father, he took an advanced stand on salvation through faith, simple belief. He so declared himself before his followers and began sending his students out in groups of 60 to proclaim to the people of India the glad tidings of free salvation, that all men, high and low, can attain bliss by faith in righteousness and justice.
Isn't it interesting how all these people send out their own missionaries, large groups to teach it to other people too, right? Gautama's wife believed her husband's gospel and was the founder of an order of nuns. His son became his successor and greatly extended the cult. He grasped the new idea of salvation through faith, but in his later years wavered regarding the Salem gospel of divine favor through faith alone. And in his old age, his dying words were, "Work out your own salvation."
That's cool.
Yeah. Right.
When proclaimed at its best, Guatemala's gospel of universal salvation, free from sacrifice, torture, ritual, and priests, was a revolutionary and amazing doctrine for its time. And it came surprisingly near to being a revival of the Salem gospel. It brought succor to millions of despairing souls, and notwithstanding its grotesque perversion during later centuries, it still persists as the hope of millions of human beings.
So it still influences people even today, in India especially.
Siddhartha taught far more truth than has survived in the modern cults bearing his name. Modern Buddhism is no more the teachings of Gautama Siddhartha than is Christianity the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth.
See, things become perverted over time. Right. The Buddhist faith. 8. To become a Buddhist, one merely made public profession of the faith by reciting the refuge. I take my refuge in the Buddha. I take my refuge in the doctrine. I take my refuge in the brotherhood. And that by doing that, you became a Buddhist. Rodney.
Buddhism took origin in a historic person, not in a myth. Gautama's followers called him Sasta, meaning master or teacher. While he made no superhuman claims for either himself or his teachings, his disciples early began to call him the Enlightened One, the Buddha. Later on,
Sakyamunai
Buddha.
Buddha. Right.
Hey, Lily.
Hello. Hey, Mary.
You.
The original Gospel of Gautama was based on the 4 noble truths. 1. The noble truths of suffering. 2. The origins of suffering. Excuse me. 3. The destruction of suffering. 4. The way to the destruction of suffering.
All about suffering.
Yeah.
Right. Millie, we're on 9488 on 1036. So you can catch up there.
Okay.
Closely linked to the doctrine of suffering and the escape therefrom was the philosophy of the Eightfold Path: right use, aspiration, speech, conduct, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and contemplation. But it was not Gautama's intent to attempt to destroy all effort, desire, and affection in the escape from suffering. Rather was his teaching designed to picture to mortal man the futility of pinning all hope and aspirations entirely on temporal goals and material objectives. It was not so much that love of one's fellows should be shunned as that true believers should also look beyond the associations of this material world to the realities of the eternal future. And that's a pretty good concept. Millie, would you take the next one, please?
The moral commandments of Gautama's preachment were 5 in number. Number 1, you shall not kill. Number 2, you shall not steal. Number 3, you shall not be unchaste. Number 4, you shall not lie. And number 5, you shall not drink intoxicating liquors. There were several additional or secondary commandments whose observance was optional with believers.
Those were the main ones, in other words. Go ahead and read that last little part of that in the next paragraph, too. Oh, never mind, you got it. I'm sorry. Ignore me. Okay. Rodney, would you take this one, please?
Yeah, I had a question. What does unchaste mean?
In other words, you should be, you should not have sex with people if you're not married.
Huh.
Unchaste.
Okay.
Okay.
Basically, I would think it means morally straight.
Morally straight. That's right. That's right.
Okay, Siddhartha hardly believed in the immortality of the human personality. His philosophy only provided for a sort of functional continuity. He never claimed.
Well, that was weird.
He never claimed. Oh, is that me?
Yeah, that's you.
He never clearly defined what he meant to include in the doctrine of nirvana. The fact that it could theoretically be experienced through mortal existence would indicate that it was not viewed as a state of complete annihilation. It implied a condition of supreme enlightenment and superior bliss, where all fetters binding man to the material world had been broken. There was freedom from the desires of mortal life and deliverance from all danger of ever again experiencing incarnation.
In other words, that he was trying to show them that give them away from these reincarnations, these incarnations over and over and over and over again. So it's not quite to the step of believing in the incarnations of the future of the path to paradise, right?
According to the original teachings of Gautama, salvation is achieved by human effort, apart from divine help. There is no place for saving faith or prayers to superhuman powers. Gautama, in his attempt to minimize the superstitions of India, endeavored to turn men away from the blatant claims of magical salvation. And in making this effort, he left the door wide open for his successors to misinterpret his teaching and to proclaim that all human striving for attainment is distasteful and painful. His followers overlook the fact that the highest happiness is linked with the intelligent and enthusiastic pursuit of worthy goals, and that such achievements constitute true progress in cosmic self-realization.
In other words, you can go after things, material in this world, and goals in your life to achieve certain things. That's not in itself evil. It's just, it's like everything in moderation, right? You can't let material things overrun your life, because then they become your life, and you lose sight of the hereafter. And that's what we're trying to stop. All right. The great truth of Siddhartha's teaching was his proclamation of a universe of absolute justice. He taught the best godless philosophy ever invented by mortal man. He was the ideal humanist and most effectively removed all grounds for superstition, magical rituals, and fear of ghosts or demons. Kind of interesting how many cultures and how many different types of religions, how long it took them to get over this ghost and demon. Millie, would you take the next one, please?
The great weakness in the original gospel of Buddhism was that it did not produce a religion of unselfish social service. The Buddhistic brotherhood was, for a long time, not a fraternity of believers, but rather a community of student teachers. Gautama forbade their receiving money and thereby sought to prevent the growth of hierarchical tendencies.
Like the church.
What?
Like the church, right?
Yeah, Gautama himself was highly social indeed. His life was much greater than his preachment. Aha! His life was much greater than his preachment.
Many lives are that way, right? All right. Rodney, would you take the next one, please?
Number 9, the spread of Buddhism. Buddhism prospered because it offered salvation through belief in the Buddha, the enlightened one. It was more representative of the Melchizedek truths than any other religious system to be found throughout Eastern Asia. But Buddhism did not become widespread as a religion until it was espoused in self-protection by the low-caste monarch Asoka, who, next to Akhenaten in Egypt, was one of the most remarkable civil rulers between Melchizedek and Michael. Asoka built a great Indian empire through the propaganda of his Buddhist missionaries. During a period of 25 years, he trained and sent forth more than 17,000 missionaries to the farthest frontiers of all the known world. In one generation, he made Buddhism the dominant religion of one half the world. It soon became established in Tibet, Kashmir, Kaiwan, Burma, Java, Siam, Korea, China, and Japan. and generally speaking, it was a religion vastly superior to those which it supplanted or upstepped.
And this next is a picture of a fragment of the sixth pillar edict of the Emperor Sejoka in 238 BC, probably from the Meru Pillar. This depiction of polished stone was written in Brahma, characters of the system of writing used in the northern subcontinent from the time of the minor Emperor Asoka. It reads left to right and is the ancestor to all modern Indian scripts. Kurasata, a script reading right to left, was used in Northwest, seeing the line, capital in front of the case. Sweetie.
The spread of Buddhism from its homeland in India to all of Asia is one of the thrilling stories of the spiritual devotion and missionary persistence of sincere religious. The teachers of Gautama's gospel not only braved the perils of the overland caravan routes, but faced the dangers of the China Seas as they pursued their mission over the Asiatic continent, bringing to all peoples the message of their faith. But the Buddhism was no longer the simple doctrine of Gautama. It was the miracleized gospel which made him a god. And the farther Buddhism spread from its highland home in India, the more unlike the teachings of Gautama it became, and the more like the religions it supplanted it grew to be.
Buddhism later on was much affected by Taoism in China, Shinto in Japan, and Christianity in Tibet. After 1,000 years in India, Buddhism simply withered and expired. It became Brahmanized and later adjectively surrendered to Islam. While throughout much of the rest of the Orient, it degenerated into the ritual which Gautama Siddhartha would never have recognized. So it totally broke down. Millie.
In the South, the fundamentalist area of the teachings of Siddhartha persisted in Ceylon, Burma, and the Indochina Peninsula. This is the Hinayana division of Buddhism, which clings to the early or asexual doctrine.
Rodney.
But even before the collapse in India, the Chinese and North Indian groups of Gautama's followers had begun the development of the Mahayana teaching of the Great Road, quote, to salvation, in contrast with the purists of the South, who held to the Hinayana, or, quote, lesser road. And these Mahayanists cast loose from the social limitations inherent in the Buddhist doctrine. And ever since has this northern division of Buddhism continued to evolve in China and Japan.
Buddhism is a living, growing religion today because it succeeds in conserving many of the highest moral values of its adherents. It promotes calmness and self-control, augments serenity and happiness, and does much to prevent sorrow and mourning. Those who believe this philosophy live better lives than many who do not.
Religion in Tibet, 10. In Tibet may be found the strangest association of the Melchizedek teaching combined with Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and Christianity. When the Buddhist missionaries entered Tibet, they encountered a state of primitive savagery, very similar to that which the early Christian missionaries found among the northern tribes of Europe. And this shows Tibetan temple. It's pretty. Billy, would you take the next one, please?
Unmute your mic.
Sorry about that phone call again. These simple-minded Tibetans would not wholly give up their ancient magic and charms. Examination of the religious ceremonies of present-day Tibetan rituals reveals an overgrown brotherhood of priests with shaven heads who practice an elaborate ritual embracing bells, chants, incense, professionals, rosaries, processionals, rosaries, images, charms, pictures, holy water, gorgeous vestments, and elaborate choirs. They have rigid dogmas and crystallized creeds, mystic rites, and special fasts. Their hierarchy embraces monks, nuns, abbots, and the Grand Lama. They pray to angels, saints, a holy mother, and the gods. They practice confessions and believe in purgatory. Their monasteries are extensive and their cathedrals magnificent. They keep up an endless repetition of sacred rituals and believe that such ceremonials bestow salvation. Prayers are fastened to a wheel, and with its turning, they believe the petitions become efficacious. Is that the word, efficacious? Among no other people of modern times can be found the observance of so much from so many religions, and it is inevitable that such a cumulative liturgy would become inordinately cumbersome and intolerably burdensome.
Kind of sounds like a Catholic church, doesn't it?
They do have stuff.
Yeah, lots of stuff. All right. Rodney.
We Tibetans have something of all the leading world religions except the simple teaching of the Trinitarian gospel, which is sonship with God, brotherhood with man, and ever-ascending citizenship in the eternal universe.
Most important point.
Excuse me. 11. Buddhist philosophy. Buddhism entered China in the first millennium after Christ, and it fitted well into the religious customs of the yellow race. In ancestor worship, they had long prayed to the dead. Now they could also pray for them. Buddhism soon amalgamated with the lingering ritualistic practices of disintegrating Taoism. This new synthetic religion, with its temples of worship and definite religious ceremonials, soon became the generally accepted cult of the peoples of China, Korea, and Japan.
Well, in some respects, it is unfortunate that Buddhism was not carried to the world until after, when Thomas' followers were had so perverted the traditions and teachings of the cult as to make of him a divine being. Nonetheless, the myth of his human life, embellished as it was with a multitude of miracles, proved very appealing to the auditors of the northern Mahayana gospel of Buddhism.
Some of his later followers taught that Sakyamuni Buddhas spirit returned periodically to earth as a living Buddha, thus opening the way for an indefinite perpetuation of Buddha images, temple rituals, and imposters, living Buddhas. Thus did the religion of the great Indian Protestant eventually find himself shackled with those very ceremonial practices and ritualistic incantations against which he had so fearlessly fought and which he had so valiantly denounced.
So he turned it into a religion just opposite of what he was trying to teach.
The great advance made in Buddhism philosophy consisted in its comprehension of the reality of our truth. Through the mechanisms of this hypothesis, Buddhists have been able to reconcile and correlate the divergencies within their own religious scriptures, as well as the differences between their own and many others. It was taught that the small truth was for little minds, the large truth for great minds.
This philosophy also held that the Buddha, divine nature, resided in all men, that man through his own endeavors could attain to the realization of this inner divinity. And his teaching is one of the clearest presentations of the truth of the indwelling adjusters ever to be made by a Eurasian religion.
But the great limitation in the original gospel of Siddhartha was it was interpreted by his followers, was that it attempted to complete liberation of the human self from all the limitations of the mortal nature by the technique of isolating the self from objective reality. True cosmic self-realization results in identification with cosmic reality and with the finite cosmos of energy, mind, spirit, bound by space and conditional time. In other words, just disconnecting yourself from all reality. Right? Which is not good. All right. Millie.
But through the ceremonies and outward observances of Buddhism, though the ceremonies and outward observances of Buddhism became grossly contaminated with those of the lands to which it traveled, this degeneration was not altogether the case in the philosophical life of the great thinkers who, from time to time, embraced this system of thought and belief. Though through more than 2,000 years, many of the best minds of Asia have concentrated upon the problem of ascertaining absolute truth and the truth of the absolute.
Rodney.
But those ceremonies and outward observances of Buddhism became grossly contaminated with those of the
I
lands
think
to
you
which
skipped a
it
paragraph,
traveled.
Rodney. I think you skipped a paragraph.
Yeah.
That's the one I've got. Oh, okay. You have a different one.
What?
Didn't Millie read that?
The evolution of a
Should be the evolution of the high concept of,
Yeah, should be.
yeah.
the evolution of concepts.
Yeah. Does that sound familiar? The evolution of a high concept of absolute was achieved through many channels of thought and by devious paths of reasoning. The upward ascent of this doctrine of infinity was not so clearly defined as was the evolution of the God concept in Hebrew theology. Nevertheless, there were certain broad levels which the minds of the Buddhists reached, carried upon, and passed through on the way to the envisioning of the primal source of the universe, of universes.
All right. Here.
1. The Gautama legend. At the base of the concept was the historic fact of the life and teachings of Siddhartha, the prophet prince of India. This legend grew in myth as it traveled through the centuries and across the broad lands of Asia until it surpassed the status of the idea of Gautama as the enlightened one and began to take on additional attributes.
2. The many Buddhas, it was reasoned that if Gautama had come to the peoples of India, then in the remote past and in the remote future, the races of mankind must have been and undoubtedly would be blessed with other teachers of truth. This gave rise to the teaching that there were many Buddhas and unlimited and infinite number, even that anyone could aspire to become one, to attain the divinity of a Buddha. Really?
3. The absolute Buddha. By the time the number of Buddhas was approaching infinity, it became necessary for the mind of those days to reunify this unwieldy concept. Accordingly, it began to be taught that all Buddhas were but the manifestation of some higher essence, some eternal one of infinite and unqualified existence, some absolute source of all reality. From here on, the deity concept of Buddhism, in its highest form, becomes divorced from the human person of Gautama Siddhartha and casts off from the limitations which had held it in leash. This final conception of the Buddha eternal can well be identified as the absolute, sometimes even as the infinite I am.
Right.
While this idea of absolute deity never found great popular favor with the peoples of Asia, it did enable the intellectuals of these eras to unify their philosophy and to harmonize their cosmology. The concept of the Buddha absolute is at times quasi-personal, at times wholly impersonal, even an infinite creative force. Such concepts, though helpful to philosophy, are not vital to religious development. Even an anthropomorphic Yahweh is of greater religious value than an infinitely remote absolute of Buddhism or Brahmanism.
At times, the absolute was even thought of as contained within the infinite I am. But these speculations were chilled comfort to the hungry multitudes who craved to hear words of promise, to hear the simple gospel of Salem, that faith in God would assure divine favor and eternal survival.
The basic concept. Most important. Right. 12. The God concept of Buddhism. The great weakness in the cosmology of Buddhism was twofold: its contamination with many of the superstitions of India and China, and its sublimation of Gautama, first as in the enlightened one, and then as the eternal Buddha, just as Christianity has suffered from the absorption of much erroneous human philosophy. So does Buddhism bear its human birthmark. But the teachings of Gautama have continued to evolve during the past 2.5 millenniums. The concept of Buddha to the enlightened Buddhist is no more the human personality of Gautama than the concept of Jehovah is identical with the spirit demon of Orient to an enlightened Christian. You know what they're talking about there? The spirit demon of Mount Horeb, burning bush. Anyway, paucity of terminology together with the sentimental retention of old nomenclature has often provocative to the failure to understand the true significance of the evolution of religious concepts.
Hey, Roger,
Yeah.
so what is that demon of Horeb?
They're talking about the God of Mount Horeb that Moses went up to get the Ten Commandments. They thought of it as a God of terrible anger, trying to strike out to the lowly humans. Okay, so it was a concept of this demon God rather than a loving father that wanted to help, take, bring along his children. Alright. Who's up? I think Rodney is. Rodney, you're up.
Well, actually, you just read it.
Oh, I did?
Excuse me. Okay, gradually the concept of God, as contrasted with the absolute, began to appear in Buddhism. Its sources are back in the early days of this differentiation of the followers of the lesser road and the greater road. It was among the latter division of Buddhism that the dual conception of God and the absolute finally matured. Step by step, century by century, the God concept has evolved until with the teachings of Ryonen, Honatsu Shonin, and Shinran in Japan, this concept finally came to fruit in the belief in Amida Buddha.
Involved. Among these believers, it is taught that the soul, upon experiencing death, may elect to enjoy a sojourn in paradise prior to entering nirvana, the ultimate of existence. It is proclaimed that this new salvation is attained by faith in the divine mercies and loving care of Amida, God of the paradise in the West. In their philosophy, the Amidas hold to an infinite reality which is beyond all finite mortal comprehension. In their religion, they cling to faith in the all-merciful Amida, who so loves the world that he will not suffer one mortal who calls on his name in true faith and with a pure heart to fail in the attainment of the supernal happiness of paradise. All right, Millie.
I can't believe I've not heard of them either.
Either.
The great strength of Buddhism is that its adherents are free to choose truth from all religions. Such freedom of choice has seldom characterized the Urantian faith. In this respect, the Shin sect of Japan has become one of the most progressive religious groups in the world. It has revived the ancient missionary spirit of Gautama's followers and has begun to send teachers to other peoples. This willingness to appropriate truth from any and all sources is indeed a commendable tendency to appear among religious believers during the first half of the 20th century after Christ.
Buddhism itself has undergone a 20th century renaissance. Through contact with Christianity, the social aspects of Buddhism have been greatly enhanced. The desire to learn has been rekindled in the hearts of the monk priests of the Brotherhood, and the spread of education through this faith will be certainly provocative of new advances in religious evolution.
So as the world evolves, they evolve.
At the time of this writing, much of Asia rests its hope in Buddhism. Will this noble faith that has so valiantly carried on through the dark ages of the past once again receive the truth of expanded cosmic realities, even as the disciples of the great teacher in India once listened to his proclamation of new truth? Will this ancient faith respond once more to the invigorating stimulus of the presentation of new concepts of God and the absolute for which it has so long searched?
Talking about the Urantia up there. Okay. All Urantia is waiting for the proclamation of the annulment message of Michael, unencumbered by the accumulated doctrines and dogmas of 19 centuries of contact with the religions of evolutionary origin. The hour is striking for presenting to Buddhism, to Christianity, to Hinduism, even to the peoples of all faiths, not the gospel about Jesus, but the living spiritual reality of the gospel of Jesus. And this was presented by Melchizedek of Megiddo. And next time, we will study paper 95, the Melchizedek teachings in the Levant. Alright, so let's say a little prayer and we'll close for the night. Millie, would you like to close us in prayer tonight? She's still out there?
Just like, I'm doing like,
Okay. Did you ask?
Yes, would you like to pray tonight? Close us?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for once again having us come together and study some of the history of how the religions of the world have formed over the last few centuries. Help us to understand that each of these religions came about by people seeking your truths, your goodness, your wisdoms. Help us all to spread what we know from the Elijah book to all people who are still seeking. That's how I came to the book. I was seeking truths. We thank you for this book. We thank you for letting us get together. We thank you for these beautiful days that we've been having and all the beautiful colorful leaves in this beautiful new orb that you have created. We ask these things and have these things in the name of Christ Michael, Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. And thank you for joining us at home. Please come see us again. Sorry it took me so long to get through this paper.
The ground around here in this subdivision is beautiful. It is everywhere.
It is.
All